Well, I have to thank UTA for this very, very kind invitation, and Dean Wright for her introduction, as well as the Aga Khan Council for Northern Texas, who together with the Aga Khan Council for the Southwest of United States have been wonderful partners of the Museum of Fine Arts, and they have really done phenomenal work to establish a public program of lectures and events that really showcase and allow people to understand something more about the Islamic world, and particularly the Islamic artistic legacy. I am going to start with this image. It's the frontispiece of probably the most beautiful Shahnameh ever made, a manuscript of which I will talk extensively in the course of the talk. The year 2010 marks the millennium of the completion of the Shahnameh, the epic of the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings by Abul Qasim Firdawsi, and has seen many kinds of celebration around the world, ranging from international conferences to exhibitions of illustrated manuscripts of the Shahnameh, as the one that opened in September at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, UK. In the late August, right after joining the staff of the Museum of Fine Arts in August of 2008, I myself proposed to organize a small exhibition to pay homage to this text and its artistic afterlife. And I intended to entitle it exactly as the title of this talk today, 1,000 Years of Feast and Lore, the Shahnameh of Firdawsi, 1010-2010. Borrowing the poet's own words, describing the lavish courtly gatherings and legendary exploits of its many protagonists. What I had in mind was to go beyond the best-known form of artistic production associated with the text, illustrated manuscript of the epic, and include all the media that have been infused with bits of the poem, from architectural decoration to textiles, down to contemporary interpretations of the poem's most famous subjects. However, the short amount of time I had available and the virtual lack of accessible artworks, mostly reserved for comparable installations in the museums around the world, forced me to abandon the project, at least for this year, for the time being. Nonetheless, celebrating the Shahnameh for me was a sort of duty, especially because I have written a whole dissertation on 350 pages of dissertation on the book. And I thought, then that I would have shared with you the concept of the exhibition. What you're going to have here is a sort of virtual exhibition. It's how I would have organized it and the kind of objects that I would have used in order to show how the Shahnameh basically produced and inspired arts in the course of this 1,000 years of its history. My first acquaintance with the Shahnameh dates back to my early years of college, in fact. About 3 months after my first class of Farsi, the professor came to the classroom one day with more than the usual exercises of Persian grammar. The verses he wanted us to read and translate were taken from one of the most celebrated episodes of the Shahnameh, the story of Rustam, who is the principal hero of the epic, and his son Sohrab. I know that this tale is probably known to some of you, at least in the audience, and I therefore decided to start the talk by quoting the last tragic lines of the poem that refers to the moment in which basically Rustam mortally, deadly wounds his son, especially because this specific passage includes and refers to some of the overarching themes of the epic, the fragility of human nature, the incomprehensibility of God's plans, and the transience of earthly existence. A little bit of background first. Rustam is a very busy hero, and I know that this image is probably the one that least conveys the fact that he's busy, because he's actually taking a nap between one of his exploits and the others. But he has a biblical-sized life. He spans, the reigns of actually all the rulers who are in the central section of the poem, therefore, talking about several hundreds of years. And his life is punctuated by victories and conquests that also include several women. Among them is Tahmineh, the daughter of an Afghan king, who approached the hero during a brief stay at her father's palace, saying that she wants to bear him a son. A night of passion follows, and before the hero takes the road again, he instructs Tahmineh to give his son a clasp and to tell him that to wear it on his arm as a token of his father. Years pass, Sohrab grows, and he learns about his valiant father and the inept king he is serving, a guy called Keykavus, who is the one represented under the canopy here. Thus, he decides to set up to invade Iran in order to dethrone the king and place on the throne his father. Learning about Sohrab's plans and being aware of the parental relationship between the two, the arch-enemy of the Iranian king, the Turanian Afrasiab, decides to exploit Sohrab's rebellion in his own favor and put the two against each other, especially favored by the fact that none of the two knows about each other's identity. They never met before, okay? But obviously Rustam knows that he has a son and Sohrab knows that he has a valiant father with the name of Rustam. Would Rustam murder his son and later realize his mistake? He would die of grief and leave Afrasiab free to march over Iran and finally dominate it. Were Sohrab to kill Rustam, instead, he would eliminate Afrasiab's principal obstacle towards the conquest of Iran. So either way, it would have gone fairly good for Afrasiab. Actually, the first option is what happens, and I'm going to quote you in translation the lines, the last lines of this episode, which are really the final moments of the battle, the moment in which Rustam realizes who is the person he has just killed. And this is Sohrab talking. I brought this on myself. This is from me. And fate has merely handed you the key to my brief life. Not you, but heaven's vault, which raised me and then killed me, is at fault. Love for my father led me here to die. My mother gave me signs to know him by. And you could be a fish within the sea, or pitch black, lost in night's obscurity, or be a star in heaven's endless space, or vanish from earth and leave no trace. But still my father, when he knows I'm dead, will bring down condemning vengeance on your head. One from this noble land will take this sign to Rustam's hands and tell him that it was mine, and say I sought him always, far and wide, and that at last, in seeking him, I died. And actually, the image that you see here is taken from one of the many illustrated manuscripts of the epic and shows Sohrab unveiling the clasp, the sign of his father, and Rustam, who is this guy with the tiger skin and the leopard headgear. You'll learn how to recognize him because he's always portrayed with these very specific attributes, tearing his clothes in the moment in which he realizes what he has done. The epic of the Shahnameh is, in fact, a unique mixture of ancient Iranian legends and history, which were transmitted orally for many centuries. Through time, a good portion of this material was organized in written collections, even though none of the early compilations has survived. Between the 6th and 7th centuries, Sasanian rulers commissioned an official history of Iran entitled Shahnameh, which means Book of Kings in Middle Persian, whose contents would be later incorporated, in fact, into Firdawsi's version. With the rise of New Persian as a language in the 10th century, many of the Arabic translations of old Pahlavi historical sources were translated back into New Persian, and therefore made additional and more specifically historical records available again in the Iranian-speaking world. The Shahnameh of Abu Mansur Muhammad bin Abd al-Razzaq, which was composed in the Hijri year of 346, which corresponds to 958 of the current calendar, under the supervision of the secretary Abu Mansur Ma'mari, was the last and most complete synthesis of these early texts. And we know that it was also the principal written source that Firdawsi used for the composition of his own Shahnameh. To these, several other orally transmitted cycles must be added, particularly the ones that contain legends and legendary sections, and which were probably versified by the poet during the early phases of the work's organization. All this is to say that Firdawsi's Shahnameh the one that we are celebrating this year, is only the last and most successful example of a long and well-established tradition of literary transmission of Iran's past and cultural ideals. Before he committed in the 10th century to the full composition of the poem that granted him immortality, an immediate predecessor, the poet Daqiqi, had already started revitalizing pre-Islamic stories and motifs, although he was never able to complete the work due to his premature death. Firdawsi took on his material, and he posed himself as the continuator of this project, in fact, aiming to produce an even more ambitious version of Iran's history, a task that, in fact, kept him engaged for the following 35 years. Although some time elapsed between Firdawsi's early inspiration and the actual composition of the poem, when he started composing the Shahnameh, he benefited from the enthusiastic patronage of Mansur, the son of Abu Mansur Muhammad Abd al-Razzaq, who was the author of the previous version of the Shahnameh. And Firdawsi was actually able to produce a first draft of the poem in spite of the fact that the supporter, the patron, died, and therefore there were financial difficulties to actually bring it to fruition. And he sold it in 994, thereby firmly establishing his authority as a gifted poet among his contemporaries. Yet he still needed a major patron to bring the project to final fruition, and someone who actually would embrace the traditional Iranian ideals at a time in which these were greatly revitalized, and therefore fulfilled the hope of a reunified country. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, who had meanwhile established his rule in eastern Iran at the very end of the 10th century, seemed to be that patron. The third and final version of the Shahnameh, which is the one that is celebrated today, was finished on the 25th of September of the year 400 of the Islamic calendar, which corresponds to March the 8th of 1010. So we are just after the millennium anniversary. And it was sent to Ghazna, which was the residence of the Ghaznavid ruler in Afghanistan, with a dedication to the Turkish Sultan. Mahmud did not react as expected to the poem. And according to the most reliable 15th century source, the one of a court historian, Timurid court historian, Nizami Aruzi, he ended up paying the poet much less than agreed. Of the 60,000 gold coins, one for each verse of the Shahnameh, which is estimated to contain as many verses, the legend reports that the poet only received 20,000 silver coins. According to Nizami Aruzi, Firdawsi was in a bathhouse when he received the reward, and contemptuously divided it between the messenger, a beer seller, and a masseur. Not long after, the poor and unrewarded poet is said to have composed a vehement satire against the Sultan. The critique has survived in fragments in the many prefaces that accompany the hundreds of copies of the poem, although scholars tend to dismiss these verses as something spurious and probably a later forgery. Whether Sultan Mahmud was moved by the satire or not, at some point he realized the mistake and therefore sent the appropriate reward for the lifetime, task of the poem. But as the money were entering the gate of Tus, the city of Tus, which is where he resided, the coffin of the poet was actually leaving the city from the back door, and therefore he never actually saw the reward. And it was the year 1020. How is the text of the Shahnameh structured? After the front matter, which includes the praise to God and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, the history of Iran unfolds and articulated in the kingdoms of 50 rulers grouped under 3 successive dynasties. The Pishdadiyan, the rulers, the mythical kings of the beginnings who established the civilization and defeated the demons, as you can see in this image. Then there were the Kayanids, who are the protagonists of the millenary struggle against Turan, one of the leitmotifs, in fact, of the epic. And the later rulers, the more historical ones, particularly the Sassanians, the last glorious dynasty that was brought down by the Arab invaders in 651. Mythical, legendary, and historical cycles follow each other in the poem, and all contribute to define Iranian's past. Iran's character and cultural boundaries, instead, are delineated by means of geographic and ethnic distinctions that are articulated in conquests, reconquests, and wars against external enemies, particularly those of Turan. Even a more problematic battle runs as the subtext of the poem, which is the fight, the battle between good and evil, which is actually to be intended as, absolute principles, but also as in ethical terms. The Turan-Iran and good and evil binaries provided the poet with the conditions to highlight, in fact, some of the most important cultural ideas that he was trying to perpetuate: honor, loyalty, obligation, and heroism. And he does that in two different ways in each case. Thus, while the virtues regulate the conduct of the characters in relation to their kings and kingdoms in the battles against Turan, in the context of the fight between good and evil, the struggle begins outside, and it's a struggle of the human side against the demonic side, and ends within each character as they face inner struggles and difficult moral tests. What is important is that both experiences confer the Shahnameh an additional and, I would say, crucial didactic value, making it into a rather unique and successful kind of so-called mirror for princes, a didactic genre used for the education of princes, whose intent was in fact in Firdawsi's mind when he composed the poem. The presentation in the Shahnameh of the exemplary deeds of the old kings provided instances of good justice and government that functioned as lessons for successive generations of rulers. Although the poem was primarily intended as a work of history, it nevertheless transformed its major figures into temporal models of ethical excellence. Key characters such as Isfandiar, of whom you see a representation on the screen, or King Khosrow, just to name two of the most famous, stand as embodiments of these virtues, even when they experience internal challenges that question the validity of certain principles. The whole text is actually constructed around these crucial issues, which not surprisingly make these episodes the most cherished and most widely adopted in various forms of artistic performance. And I'm referring to storytelling, which was a very interesting way in which the Shahnameh was constantly performed, but also to pictorial forms of artistic adaptation, and therefore illustrated manuscripts, ceramic ware, murals, and so on. Before moving on to the specific artistic interpretations of the poem, I would like to add a few more words about the cultural meaning of the Shahnameh, especially if we want to try to understand how and why the poem became so influential in the centuries that followed its composition. Scholars have assumed various motivating forces behind Firdawsi's opus magnum. The poem has often been interpreted as a reaction to the Semitization of the region produced by the spread of Islam, which was carried out by Arabs in the 7th century. The supporters of this idea have remarked how Iran's history and heroic traditions had been overshadowed and replaced by new religious concerns, when they had not been misinterpreted or openly condemned, in fact, as falsities. In their opinion, the process of Islamization of the Iranian lands must have felt as a serious threat to the survival of those traditions that remained incompatible with the new worldview. Even though ideas like nation and national pride, the terms that the above-mentioned interpretations use, are much later Western inventions, the interpretation of Firdawsi's work as a celebration of the cultural richness of the Iranian nation has in fact taken root. More recently, though, the scholar Julie Scott Maysami has called for a more nuanced consideration of the reasons behind the emergence of works of historical, semi-historical, historical content between the 10th and 11th centuries, which obviously include the Shahnameh. The anti-Arab sentiment was probably not the major factor that influenced the so-called Persian literary renaissance, a phenomenon that had its beginnings under the Samanids in the late 10th century. In addition to a quote-unquote national sense, which was demonstrated by the Iranians in a very distinctive way already at the time, the geographic distance from the early centers of Arabic culture, in fact, is what probably facilitated the adoption of Persian as a court language, as a literary language, and therefore all the cultural pursuits that followed with it. The idea of a nationalistic motivation behind the literary achievements of the Shahnameh has also been recently criticized by some Iranian scholars who see in this interpretation the product of a Western and essentially Orientalist intellectual approach, recourse to issues such as ethnicity, the notion of an Indo-European and Aryan material, body of material, against the Semitic, so the Iranian versus the Arabs, and nationalistic revitalism in order to evaluate the cultural implication of the Persian epic is considered to be not only anachronistic, but it is also said to reveal the scarce and simplistic knowledge that non-Iranian scholarship possesses of Iran and its historical complexity. There is no doubt about the fact that terms like Iran and Persia are often anachronistically used by scholars to connote what was a rather unstable and fluid geographic region that in the past, as much as today, regrouped a wide array of ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups. At the same time, not only did the Shahnameh gather different traditions from the lore that are, putting together lore and popular accounts of regions that today fall within four different modern states: Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, but which are otherwise culturally essential part of what used to be called Greater Iran. So the region that we are thinking of, I mean, Iran today, Iran's, boundaries like cut here, but at the time in which the Shahnameh was being composed, Greater Iran was an enormous region that actually comprised what today falls within the confines of different states. In addition to this, the poem's reception, its adoption and perpetuation by dynasties of both indigenous and foreign origin that ruled the area, are a testimony to its cultural importance and distinctiveness. From the patronage of the Ilkhanid Mongols in the 13th and 14th century, who turned the poem's verses into ornamental friezes for their summer residence at Takht-e-Suleiman, and who commissioned its first grandiose illustration in codex format, which is known as the Great Mongol Shahnameh, to the political use of the Qajar dynasty, made of its themes with the purpose of recompacting the country's cultural heritage, the Shahnameh came to be used as a symbol of Iranianness and was evidently recognized already very early on as a form of celebration of ideals with which everybody in the Persianate world, and by Persianate I mean really this greater Iranian sphere, could identify. If the case of the Shahnameh as an emblem of Persianate culture does not suffice as a proof of an existing notion for a distinctively Iranian cultural tradition very early on, the bibliophilism of rulers and aristocrats of the past is at least an act of recognition of a shared literary tradition with which evidently past rulers identify themselves. The practice of collecting and copying, reproducing books, particularly of Persian literature, became part of wider cultural agendas of dynasties of foreign origins, like the Mongol Ilkhanids that I mentioned before, but also the Timurid dynasty, the second Mongols who actually ruled the eastern part of the Islamic world between the end of the 14th century and throughout the 15th century. And this derived from their desire and the necessity actually to assimilate local culture in order to ground their ideological claims of legitimate rulers. In his reconstruction of the contents of the library of the Timurid prince Baysungur Mirza, who can really be considered one of the most prolific patrons of Islamic art in the history of Islamic art production, the sort of the Lorenzo il Magnifico of Herat, basically. He is actually almost a contemporary of the Medici ruler. David Roxburgh called the attention to the preferences governing the prince's book selection, and I'm quoting here. Illustrated poetic and didactic works make up by far the greatest number of Bayzungur's books. The didactic works included both works of specific advice that could be used in the real world and equally useful moral messages conveyed in various ways through narratives. End of quote. Illustrated poetic works show a clear preference for classical works of poetry and prose that could provide ethical suggestions through entertaining stories and anecdotes. The Kalila Wadimna, which is the moralizing story of two jackals, or Sadi's Golestan, for example, Rose Garden, a collection of didactic tales and anecdotes that had very, very important roles, where, in addition obviously to the Shahnameh, of which you see a copy produced in the royal workshop of Baysungur, played a major part in the selection of the texts that belonged to this king, to the point that actually multiple copies of this text are attested to have been produced in the span of a few years. Therefore, you know, these kings actually had various copies of these poems, including the Shahnameh. The book selection of Bayzungur's library closely corresponds to the texts that are considered to be a part of the literary curriculum of the erudite statesman. Nezami Aruzi mentions the Quran, the prophetic traditions of Hadith, the history of the early caliphs, but also says that one should read the books of the ancients, the writings of their successors, the poetical works of the Arabs and the Persian poets, among which the epic of Firdawsi. Such an explicit reference by the Timurid historian, we are talking about 15th century historical record, confirms the value attributed to certain works of literature and the many ways, in fact, in which their possession and reproduction contributed to build the public and the intellectual stature of some of these rulers. Last but not least, Bayzungur's case confirms the active role that literature had in the education of princes and nobles, because it transmitted traditional ethical standards through moral exemplar provided by these official atemporal figures. The continuous production of Shahnamehs, illustrated or unillustrated, and the important position that the poem maintained in Iranian culture throughout its history confirm, in fact, the validity of the principles that it tries to celebrate. Through time, Persian rhetoric became infused with constant references to figures and metaphors drawn from the national epic, to the point that rulers in official correspondence of 16th and 17th century, in fact, addressed themselves with the names of ancient rulers. And so they say, I am the Jamshid of this time, and you are the usurper, the Zahak of my age. The adoption of the Shahnameh as a mirror for princes is indeed related to the firm cultural statements associated with the deeds and conduct of key characters who supplied behavioral models. But as an art historian, my belief is that the educational impact of these works owed something to the images in the moment in which illustrations, such as the ones that you see, started to accompany the copies of the Shahnameh, because illustrations and images have an immediacy that words cannot convey, and sometimes you can actually guess things in a second instead of going through the whole story to actually grasp the moral. So there is something about images in the images gave, and a way in which they contributed to perpetuate and make the Shahnameh an even stronger cultural product. When were the first illustrated manuscripts of the Shahnameh produced? As of today, the earliest illustrated copies of the Shahnameh of Firdawsi are datable to the first decades of 1300, so about 300 years after the poem was written. And this is probably because, you know, we really haven't found, there's nothing left from the dates from prior to that time on paper. And they include a series of dispersed small manuscripts carrying illustrations of several key episodes in the form of narrow rectangular bands, as the one that you see here. This is actually a page of one of the oldest surviving illustrated copies of the Shahnameh. The example that actually you see here actually illustrates the introduction of the game of chess, which occurred under the reign of the Sasanian ruler Khosrow Anushirvan. According to the story, one day the ambassador from an Iranian Raja arrived to the Persian court of Khosrow bearing several gifts from their ruler, and these gifts included an elaborate board with curiously carved pieces of ebony and ivory. Presenting the game to the king, the visitor issued a challenge to the courtiers. "O great king, fetch your wise men and let them solve the mysteries of this game. If they succeed, my master, the king of Hind, will pay tribute as an overlord. But if they fail, it will be proof that the Persians are of lower intellect, and therefore we will not pay tribute to you anymore." The courtiers were shown the board. They sat down for an entire day and night, and then Bozorg Mihr, who is the celebrated wise vizier of the king, solved the game, and therefore, the Raja of Hind actually was forced to pay the tribute. Even before these early illustrations of the poem appeared, some of the stories of the Shahnameh had in fact nourished the creativity of Muslim craftsmen in the Islamic world. And I'm talking in particularly about ceramic wares with motifs and scenes taken from the poem, or even bordered with verses taken from the Shahnameh, which were produced in the course of the 13th centuries. And one of the most interesting reproductions, in fact, refer to sumptuous inlaid metalwork vessels, as the one that you see here on the screen. And there is a companion candlestick of this piece that is today in the Decorative Arts Museum in Paris, of which I brought you the detail because I could only find a photograph, in fact, a reproduction of the detail, which actually shows, is sort of decorated with scenes taken from the story of Feridun and the usurper Zahak, who is a guy sort of an Arab prince who can be recognized by two snakes coming out of his shoulders, which are the sign of the pact with the devil. And you actually see it here in a very stylized way coming out of the shoulders, but this is, the most usual way in which he is represented in the book painting. Well, actually, according to the legend, let me tell you the story about Zahak and how he got the bloody, snakes on his shoulders. Zahak was in fact seduced by Ahriman. Ahriman is the name of the devil in the Persian tradition. And he promises him power and wealth. Zahak accepts the seduction, and the devil plots against his father, who gets killed in an accident, and therefore he can actually access the throne. The devil disappears and takes the form of a cook, because the devil takes, in fact, many shapes, and shows up at court one day hoping to work for the king. The king accepts and prepares these beautiful meals for the new ruler. And he gains his trust at some point. And one day he asks if he can get the honor of kissing his shoulders. And Zahak obviously doesn't really foresee any problem. And in the moment in which he kisses his shoulders, these two snakes come out of the shoulders, and actually he's sort of forced, really doomed, to feed them with human brains for the rest of his life. Particularly noteworthy among the objects that contain direct references to the Shahnameh are a series of ceramic plates and vessels that are executed in the so-called Mina'i painting technique. Mina'i means enameled in Persian, and the technique is also known as haftrang because normally it's used in some of the most beautiful examples, 7 different colors and 7 different firings. So it was a very, very time-consuming ceramic techniques. It actually used also very costly pigments And because of this, it was a very short-lived tradition. It actually appeared in the Iranian world towards the end of the 12th century, and it probably ended towards the middle of the 13th century, also as a result of the Mongol invasion that actually arrived with Genghis Khan and brought about the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and with the capture of Baghdad in 1256. In some of these Minai pieces, actually in all the three pieces, and we're going to look at them in detail, there are some of the most emblematic and best known stories of the Shahnameh that later witnessed further pictorial elaboration in the book format. But before we get to the books, in the 13th century, that's the way the Shahnameh was being represented. The first one is, again, the story of Feridun and Zahak. Feridun is a Persian king, and he's normally recognized, he's represented with the attribute of the ox, because he was actually nurtured and raised by a cow for a number of different reasons that I'm not going to tell you, but this is the way he's represented. And this is the moment in which he's escorting Zahak, after he has managed to dethrone him, to Mount Damavand, where he will be chained to eternity. Now, the poet, the painter of both this ceramic piece and the page of manuscript actually has forgotten the snakes, but we really recognize the theme from the fact that the ruler who's doing that is riding the ox, which is a very specific way of representing Feridun. The second piece is really an outstanding and absolute unique beaker. It is a little tiny beaker, this small, that is now in the Freer and Sackler Gallery in Washington, that actually has on its friezes, on its band, it really plays out a whole story of the Shahnameh, which is the story of Bijan, a Persian prince, and Manijeh, a Turanian princess, who fall in love with each other. According to the story, the two basically meet after Bijan goes on an expedition to kill wild boars towards, in an area of Iran that is really bordering with Turan. There is a sort of a festival that you actually see portrayed here with polo games and a number of activities. And the two get to know each other. They are inside a tent. What happens is that, they basically fall in love with each other. And after 2 days, she has to go back to the castle, but she doesn't want to leave the lover. So she gives him a potion so that he falls asleep, so that she can actually carry him to the palace of his father. When the father finds out, and he's Afraziab, the same guy who tried to get Rustam in trouble with Sahrab, he gets really, really angry and decides to kill the Persian. What an offense for a Persian to seduce a Turkish princess. And here you actually see the guy being summoned by the king. Okay, and so he decides to build a gallop and hang him. But then a courtier decides to sort of tells him, look, you know what the Persians are. I mean, you're going to create the excuse for another invasion and for another war. And so he decides to actually build a well, actually to dig out a well that you actually see here, and throw the prisoner there and leave him there chained with Manijeh overlooking the thing as a punishment for having allowed him to do this. And here you actually see Bijan in the well. I know that it doesn't quite look like a well, but it is a well. And around basically the basin, what you will have is actually Rustam, the hero Rustam, coming and freeing Bijan at the end of the adventure. The last scene is also probably the most famous scene of all, and portrays the Sasanian king Bahram Gur, Bahram the Honagar hunter, with his slave girl Azadeh, who plays the harp. The story goes that one day the ruler decides to go to hunt with his favorite girl, Azadeh, his favorite slave. The slave, while singing and playing the harp, challenges him to show his talent with a bow. First asking him to turn a male gazelle into a female, and vice versa, and then asking him to pin hoof and head of another gazelle with one arrow only. He actually manages to do that, and the slave is somewhat, impressed and horrified by his cruelty, and actually voices this disappointment, which was not a very good thing to do, because what he does, he pushes her off the camel and tramples her. And what you see here on the plate, it doesn't go that well for her. She should have kept the mouth shut. But what you see in the plate, which is the interesting stuff, is the way the image is collapsed. The story is collapsed in one image. You see the two riding the camel. He shoots the arrow in which, the gazelle is actually the paw pinned to the ear. And Azadeh is already under the camel being tramped after she has made the comment about how cruel he had been. In the manuscript interpretation of the same scene, and you can actually recognize the scene even without reading the text, because you have, this iconic image of the prince with the harpist, on the camel. You see the three exploits played out together. Here he cuts off the horns of the animal, therefore, turning him into a female. And then he actually shoots the arrows on the head of the female to make her look like a man, like a male, and then again pinning Paul to the ear of the last animal. Now, this very concise approach, particularly the one that you see on the plate, because this is a later manuscript illustration. So you have to think that here we are, in the 13th century, and that's the way the Shahnameh is being illustrated. This doesn't quite, anticipate the wealth of representation that we achieve a few decades later with the so-called Mongol Shahnameh, which was the first major royal commission of an illustrated manuscript of the Shahnameh associated with the patronage of the last Ilkhanid rulers, Abu Sa'id. This manuscript is really one of the masterpieces of Persianate painting, in fact, and it was dismembered at the beginning of the 20th century by an art dealer, and therefore dispersed. So today, only 58 of the images survive. The text is completely lost. And a scholar, Sheila Blair, actually, who has dedicated different studies to the poem, has managed to reproduce, kind of reconstruct the manuscript, and she estimates that in its intact format, the manuscript was probably a 280 folios manuscript, including about 200 images, which was a veritable revolution in the way the poem was reproduced. Think about the fact that the poem up to this point was only copied in written version and had sometimes very, very representative images of key episodes. Now you have full pictorial programs being developed for it. So there is a shift in the way the poem is presented. The ideological motivation, actually the presentation of the Shahnameh in such a sumptuous version, has been interpreted by scholars as a further act of cultural assimilation by the Mongol rulers. These were Mongols who were trying to rule Iran, and they had to make themselves accepted by the local population. So they were trying literally to embrace local culture and reproduce it in the best way possible. And this ideological motivation is sort of reflected in other acts of artistic patronage that have the Shahnameh as the constant element, such as the decorative program of ceramic decoration that decorated Takht-e Sulaiman, which was her summer residence in northern Iran. The palace that was built started in 1275 by the ruler Abaka was covered with dados of tiles that have verses of the Shahnameh. What you see here are verses of the Shahnameh, which were alternated with scenes of the Shahnameh. And I'm sure that now you can recognize at least one of them in this, Bahram Guren Azadeh, and probably also this because you have an ox, a guy riding the ox without the Zahak, but it's still Feridun. So they had an entire palace dedicated with tiles recounting the Shahnameh. Literally, the building was reciting the Shahnameh in itself. And the ideological implication of this specific poem have also been remarked upon by Abulala Sudavar. The choice of specific subjects for the pictorial program that accompanied the book, which illustrates at once episodes of the Shahnameh, but also contemporary episodes of Mongol history in a very subtle way, have led the scholar to conclude that this manuscript was in fact an Abu Sa'id Nameh, meaning a chronicle of Abu Sa'id, who was the patron of the manuscript, who had used the mold of the Shahnameh to tell his own story of legends and exploits. Now, we know that in the course of its history, the Shahnameh really provided a mold, a pattern for dynastic histories and accounts of rulers, and many were produced, in fact, in the course of the successive centuries that used really the mythical garb of the Shahnameh to produce proper accounts of a dynasty or of a ruler, which tells something about the way the Shahnameh, you know, the position, the way it was held in people's minds. And again, the explanation for this is found in the fact that the Shahnameh was part of a shared literary and culture that belonged to this greater Iranian region that, as you can see, is this blue region that really stretches and covers a lot of regions. And in fact, soon after the production of Shahnameh was produced in this area, it even exited Iran to reach Ottoman Turkey, so to go in this direction and to enter the Indian subcontinent, in particular under the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the middle of the 16th century. He had court chronicles whose name was Shahnameh, which meant, you know, really the Shahnameh producers, the ones who were producing court chronicles that obviously didn't have many legends and were more focused on real historical events, which yet used and had the Shahnameh in their heads, in their minds as a model. And actually, the one that you see here is the one that was composed by Luqman, who was a Shahnameh and a court historian for the successor of Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim II. And Selim II is very important also because he was the receiver, the recipient of the most beautiful copy of the Shahnameh, illustrated copy of the Shahnameh ever produced, which was produced in Iran at the beginning of the 16th century and then sent as a gift to Selim II as an accession. And what you see here, the second guy carrying books, the two books represented there, are the Shahnameh I'm going to talk about now, which is the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp. Looking at this frontispiece, we actually can already tell the level of elaboration and the quality of this manuscript that was indeed the most lavish and ambitious illustrated manuscript of the Shahnameh ever produced in the history of illustrated Shahnamehs. When it was intact, because this is another of those manuscripts that ended up being torn apart and sold as single leaves, it contained 746 folios and 258 full pages illustrations such as this. And actually this image, which is my favorite painting ever, is in the collection of His Highness the Aga Khan and illustrates the very first reign at the very beginning of the ruler. The superb quality of the paper, the pigments, the calligraphy also reveals the artistry of a large team of talents which were in fact gathered in the royal workshop of Shah Ismail, who is supposed to be not only the patron of this book, but the founder of the Safavid dynasty, the dynasty that established Shiism as a state religion in Iran. And he actually dedicated this manuscript to his son Shah Tahmasp, hence the name Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp, when he accessed the throne in 1524. The book actually took more than 20 years to be completed. It had 3 generations of artists that include some of the best, the most renowned names and the most talented artists in the history of Persianate book painting, and sort of gave and shows actually when you look at the details of this page. This is a page that is about, the painting is probably measuring 15 inches by 10. So if you think about the size of the image and the intricacy and the level of quality of the composition. Now, Shah Tahmasp was a great lover of the arts, and in fact, you know, he really had the best atelier probably that possible. You know, the peak of the arts of the book are under him. And yet what happened in 1550s, he repented at some point. He had a moment of, a pious conversion, and therefore he renounced and banned from his court all these forms of distraction. Art was at some point considered to be a distraction, in addition to opium and alcohol, which were additional distractions for him. And he decided to close the royal atelier, which meant that all these artists at this stage were forced to flee and leave Iran, leave Greater Iran, and start going towards the Ottoman court and towards the court of the Mughals to seek for work, to search for a job. And that's the moment in which Persianate painting actually ended up becoming known and influencing the pictorial tradition of both the Ottoman production and the Indian production. This Shahnameh of Selim Khan, which is not an actual Shahnameh, but is a chronicle of the reign of Selim Khan, is the product of this very specific historical moment. The first century of Safavid painting saw also the production of innumerable large illustrated copies of the Shahnameh for commercial purposes. So there were a lot of people at some point, not only royal rulers, as it was the case until that point, who wanted illustrated Shahnameh books. And the city of Shiraz was a major center of production of illustrated copies of the book, most of which are today scattered between Turkish collections and Europe, which means that probably the Turkish market had become a very, very hot market for this kind of productions. The Safavid era is incidentally also the period in which the public recitations of the poem were reinstated, and therefore coffee houses and public squares were the places where the so-called Kissa Khan or Shahnameh Khan, which were professional reciters of the Shahnameh, had in fact, daily activities and daily presentations and performances of stories of the Shahnameh. And then, there are a lot of motifs that are made popular by the Shahnameh. For example, the simorgh, which is the Persianate interpretation of the phoenix, of the Chinese phoenix, or dragons that, challenge many of the rulers and princes in the Shahnameh, who actually become decorative motifs, sort of kind of extracted by the context and become, ways, decorative patterns that enter really multiple medias. Lacquer work, these are 2 book covers painted in lacquer, as well as textiles woven with patterns and motifs that have resonance that, inevitably, immediately evoke the Shahnameh. And my favorite one is actually this carpet that is decorated with a scroll, with a tendril of little heads, which is a sort of wak-wak scroll. And the wak-wak tree, or the speaking tree, is a tree that Alexander the Great meets in the Shahnameh during one of his trips. So you see how many of these motifs were actually extracted and became decorative motifs itself, that really show the many ways in which the Shahnameh actually literally reincarnated itself in different media across time and space. The Safavid period is also the moment in which actually pre-Islamic tradition started to be fused with an Islamic, specifically Shiite ethos, and this is something that will eventually inform all the cultural productions associated specifically with Iran. And this is what happens, for example, under the Qajar dynasty, a dynasty that ruled Iran between 785 and until the first quarter of the 20th century. So we really enter modern history here. And when the citadel of the palace of Astarabad is documented to have been decorated again with cycles of the Shahnameh. So the founder of the Qajar dynasty, by painting his royal palace with cycles of the Shahnameh, still presented himself as the legitimate followers of those kings of the past. And after him, Fath Ali Shah, who is really the maker of the Safavid dynasty, of the Qajar dynasty, dedicating himself really to produce Shahnameh, a book of the kings of kings, in which he was telling his own history with a number of legendary exploits that he probably never did, but again using the mold, the meter, the mythical approach that the Shahnameh had offered and for many, many centuries. And the rhetoric of the Shahnameh was even exploited in elaborate tile panels decorating the royal palace of the Golestan, as well as the city gates of many, many cities. And here you see really an iconic scene, an iconic image of the Shahnameh. All illustrated Shahnamehs have an illustration of this mythical battle of Rustam against the white demon, and it's particularly dear to me because obviously having written a dissertation on the demons, this is the kind of images that I was obviously looking for. And obviously it's a symbol of triumph of good over evil, you know, in sort of metaphorical terms. But it's a theme that well suited the ambitions of the Qajars, who were really trying to defend Iran at the time from potential invaders. I mean, this is a time in which the colonial ambitions of Europe had reached everywhere except from Iran, and they were trying to penetrate Iran to sort of cover entirely the Middle East. So the Qajars were really trying to send a very, very clear message, and using again the Shahnameh as a pillar of their cultural image, of at least of what they were trying to communicate. And if you think that the Shahnameh really stopped inspiring artistic creativity to the historical dynasties, I decided to bring you a contemporary work, which is a real satirical work, in fact, which really represents, again, our hero Rustam in the process of fighting against an enemy that, as you can see, is not a Turanian anymore, but is an American soldier, kind of foreseeing a future invasion of Iran by some other invaders. That really tells how, again, you know, even in contemporary practice, the Shahnameh is still lingering there, is still offering opportunities to debate certain cultural achievements or the loss of them. So in conclusion, this wide array of works in different media and from different times are eloquent witnesses of the persistence of the Shahnameh in people's minds and hearts for the last 1,000 years. And really, like a prophecy, the works of art that we have seen and many works of literature that were in fact inspired by the Shahnameh have turned Firdawsi's dreams into real. This is what he says at the end of his poem. I have reached the end of this great history, and all the land will be filled with talk of me. I will not die. These seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave. And men of sense and wisdom will proclaim when I'm gone my praises and my fame. Thank you for your attention.